So today's episode is sponsored by the Clean Air Task Force.
The Clean Air Task Force, also known as CATAF or CATF, is a global non-profit working to safeguard against the worst impacts of climate change by accelerating the development and the deployment of low-carbon energy and other climate-protecting technologies.
They bring more than 25 years of internationally recognised expertise in climate policy and are known for being pragmatic and non-ideological. So they're really focusing on what works rather than trying to narrow down the solution set.
We're really grateful for their support for this season, and I recommend you take a look at their work on their website, which is www.catf.us. Thank you. Hi, I'm Amy, the co-founder of Earthset, and today I'm at OME EV's offices for our March event, which is all about carbon removals. What's real, what's hype, and who pays? We've got three fantastic speakers. We've got Sonali Mitra from Curate, Richard Barker from Counteract, and Codie Rossi from Clean Air Task Force. We're going to dive deep into what is this carbon removal stuff all about? What are they? How do you make them? How do you buy them? How do you finance them? How do you regulate them? And how do we scale them up for the net zero emissions targets? It's going to be a fantastic chat. And I'd like to thank both OME EV for hosting us tonight, but also the Clean Air Task Force for sponsoring tonight's event and this podcast. Thank you everybody who took part. Enjoy. Hi, welcome to Earthset. I think a lot of people here have been before, but if you haven't, you're especially welcome. We're a community of investors, policymakers and founders. We come together regularly, mainly at the big events that we happen today, the first Tuesday every month, where we deep dive into a policy or a climate issue we want to discuss. We also have things like book clubs and a podcast. But as well as trying to inform and to find out about new things, we also want to be a place for connection. So this is a place where hopefully you can meet people who will help you on your mission to go faster, smoother, better, more strategically. So at the end of tonight, please make sure that you kind of have a chat to somebody sitting near you and kind of ask what you'd like to have, but also how maybe you can help. That's part of our mission. Before we start today, I have lots and lots of thank yous and introductions to get us going with. First off, obviously, for lovely OME for being here tonight. This is our third time of being here. It's a lovely place. It's a really, really kind of wonderful, kind of cozy atmosphere. And if you don't know OME, they are Europe's fastest growing EV charging company, combining smart, grid-responsive technology with a genuine focus on making charging cheaper, greener, and easier for drivers. I particularly like to thank Ross, who is standing in the middle there, who is COO, who's made tonight happen and of keeping us fed and watered. Whatever you want. Anyway, and
you're getting promoted, right?
Yeah. But anyway, do take a moment to talk to Ross later and talk to him because and find out what they're up to. Our other thanks go to the Clean Air Task Force, who are sponsoring tonight and the podcast for tonight. They are a global non-profit working to safeguard against the worst impacts of climate change by accelerating the development and deployment of low-carbon energy and other climate-protecting technologies. They've got over 25 years of internationally recognised climate policy expertise. They take a pragmatic and non-ideological approach to climate advocacy. As you can tell tonight, we are filming the discussion, so if you don't want to be on camera, just think about that before you put your hand up, because you probably will be otherwise. And then finally, to introduce my speakers. So Codie in the middle here is representing Clean Air Task Force tonight. He's the Director of Carbon Management and Markets at Clean Air Task Force. He leads their work on carbon removal, policy and market design, focusing on how removals interact with compliance systems in the UK and Europe. His background spans climate policy, regulatory development and carbon markets, and he has been closely involved in setting frameworks and guardrails for scaling removals. Richard Barker here on my left is a partner at Counteract. He spent many years advising corporates and investors on carbon strategy. He has diligenced hundreds of carbon projects across nature-based and engineered pathways and brings deep expertise in risk assessment, additionality, permanence, and the commercial realities of scaling carbon carbon removal markets. And then finally, last but definitely not least, is the Carbon Finance Director of Curate. Her background spans climate finance and sustainable investments. At Curate, she focuses on constructing diversified portfolios of durable carbon removals for corporate buyers. Her work sits at the intersection of science, finance, and standards, translating complex and regulatory variables into something capital markets can understand and price. So if we don't understand carbon rules at the end of all this, we are all really, really stupid, basically, because these basically are the experts. So quite frankly, this is it'll be on us. But it is a complicated area. I mean, Richard's going to go into some definitions, but really, simply, carbon removal is a process of taking carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and storing it durably. That sounds pretty easy. But quite frankly, as we're going to find out, it's actually incredibly complicated. It's complicated in the science, it's complicated in the product and innovation, the regulatory side, the financing side, even just the simplicity of supply and demand. So we're just going to go through tonight talking about what is it really, how's it being bought and regulated, how's it being paid for, what makes a unit of this stuff, and how do we find out if it's credible or not, and what are the chances of doing this at scale? So really, fundamentally, I'm going to stop now and I'm going to hand over to the experts. And first off, I'm going to ask Richard to set the scene for us a bit and tell us a bit about what carbon removal is and what it's not.
Okay. Thanks for coming, everybody, by the way. So before I go and answer trying what it is, I think it's worth just taking a second to say why. So I'm sure as everyone here understands, the fundamentals of what is driving climate change is the atmospheric concentration of CO2. And when we talk about reduction of emissions, so moving to renewables and other bits and pieces, what we're doing is we're reducing the flow of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. So we're not reducing the concentration, we're just slowing the level of increase in concentration. The Earth has a natural metabolism and it absorbs CO2 into oceans, into soil, into trees, into plants, into minerals, and you name it. But that is a natural rate. And the challenge we have from a societal perspective, but also a planetary perspective, is that there is some stuff that is really hard on a human basis to reduce emissions from. It's called hard to abate. And there is a thought that at the end of kind of our decarbonization journey, there is a chunk of emissions where it'd be cheaper to remove it out of the atmosphere rather than kind of prevent the activity that's going on. So that's the first reason why we're doing it. The second reason is that the concentration levels that we are kind of putting into the atmosphere are creating a carbon debt or an overhang. And, the reality is when we get to 1, 2, 3 degrees of global warming, the only way you can kind of temper that and bring that back is by removing the CO2 in the atmosphere. And allied to that is the challenge of the kind of runaway effects that may or may not be in play with things like the thawing of the Arctic tundra and the release of methane, which is just going to double down on those kind of climate effects. So in the first instance, carbon removal is about kind of dealing with the hard to abate end in an economic way, but also writing the kind of carbon debt so we kind of get a handle, and this is in the next 50, 100, 200 years, a handle on the absolute level of concentration of CO2. So then the next question is, what is it? And, just because I'm a deep kind of tech wonk in this, the two things that I'm always, this is my kids ask me this question is, so the first question goes, Dad, is that like stopping it going out of, chimneys and things? No, that's carbon capture and point source. So carbon removal is not that, right? And then they go, okay, so it's not that. What is it? You go, well, it's actually removing CO2 that's already out in the atmosphere. Now that sounds super easy, but I'll explain in a minute, and I'm sure the other panelists will. So we're taking it out of the atmosphere. Then they go, oh, is that planting trees? Because I heard about just planting trees is carbon removal. Yes, it is planting trees, but it's not just planting trees. And then the other thing most people will have heard of is Is it those kind of fans, the direct air capture thing that's you hear about this company called Climeworks in Iceland and a few other things? It is that, but as I jokingly say, it's not only fans. It's not only trees. It is a whole lot more. And actually, the reason why it's so exciting to be in this space is that it's not surprising. The world is a carbon system. And many of our industrial processes are carbon systems. They're moving carbon from one place to another. So the answer to this problem is literally all around you. So the solutions to removing carbon are in the oceans, they're in the rivers, they're in the way we conduct agriculture and its interface with soil, they're in the way we think about forestry, they're in the way we think about minerals and how we use those and how they interface with our industrial systems. And they're in engineered solutions like direct air capture, but that's not the only one. So it literally is, even though it sounds like an incredibly niche, sub-niche of climate, it is everything in the world. So that's the exciting bit, and that creates huge opportunity from an investor perspective, huge complexity from a policy perspective, and huge understanding and uncertainty from buyers and other participants in this place, because it is super complicated. It's not like going renewable energy. It's either a panel or it's a kind of wind turbine. This is so much more complicated than that.
And just give us the kind of this unit idea. So just tell us a bit about, if you were buying a carbon removal, what would you be buying? What is the thing that it is that you are trading in? What is this carbon removal?
Because I talk a lot, but
No, I'm very happy to jump in there. So I think one of the things that we almost always hear when we talk about a unit of carbon is a carbon credit. And effectively, the way that I like to think about it is that a carbon credit has 3 variable elements to it. So you can think about a ton of carbon that is removed, and that's one variable. The second one that I love to think about is, once you've removed that carbon, how long is it actually going to stay removed? And in a lot of other discourse, you might find it called durability or permanence. And then the third variable that I think about quite a bit is, okay, the carbon credit says it's going to deliver a ton of carbon by X years. What is the probability of that carbon actually being removed and that ton of carbon being removed? So if you add these 3 variables up together, those are all of the complexities that you actually put into a carbon credit. And I think if I think about buyers or investors, when they start to, or even project developers, when they start to price this unit of carbon credit, they're factoring these variables in, which makes it even more complex. There isn't a simple answer to just a ton of carbon removed.
Just briefly going back to the unit, at the moment, how many units are we dealing with at the moment? Or if you at the moment.
Okay, so the size of the challenge we talk about first of all, then we'll talk about how we're doing in the challenge. So global man-made emissions of CO2 and greenhouse gases is around about 55, 56, 57 gigatons, billion tons. That's a big number. If you think what a billion tons looks and feels like, billion tons is quite easily take a cubic kilometer, so a kilometer by a kilometer by a kilometer of water. That is a billion tons. So and gas is a lot lighter than water. So if it's CO2, you imagine how big that is. And that would be let me get it right, a 20 kilometer balloon of CO2 is 1 billion tons. So we're producing a lot of this stuff. And the atmosphere, 50% of the atmosphere falls below 5 miles. So even though the world seems really big, we're in this really small meniscus of atmosphere that we're just pumping all of this stuff into. So the scale is around 50 to 60 billion tons of emissions. And, if you read the IPCC reports, you read the nature of decarbonization, transition to electrification, all the other bits and pieces, the kind of experts tend to say there is between 5 to 15 billion tons a year of carbon removal that will have to be done if we've got a hope of stabilizing atmospheric carbon, if we've got a hope of stabilizing climate change, and if we've got a hope of kind of, creating an industrial base that deals with carbon as a waste that we as a society produce. So that is a big number. Now, how are we doing on that journey? The nature of forestry, commercial forestry today, and other activities, which is planting trees and chopping them down 30 years later, if you were to calculate that, is roughly around 2 billion tons a year. But I think it's pretty much understood that isn't additional because it's in and out of the equation. You're chopping a tree down, using it. So if we discount commercial forestry as an activity, the human level of carbon removal that exists today is about 2 million tons. So 2 million on 10 billion is we're 1/5,000th of the way there. So this means this industry, if we're going to hit those kind of figures by 2050, 2060, 27, is growing at a phenomenal rate. Every year, I think it's meant to be 30-odd%. So this is, from an investor perspective, we would go, wow, this could be one of the defining new asset classes in a 20 to 30-year time horizon with all the IP value that sits underneath that. And imagine mobile telephony in 1980. There weren't nobody was investing in Foxconn telephone manufacturing plants in China. No one was putting up phone masts to take signals. No one even thought of what 5G was. But the fundamental IP and patents that sit behind mobile phones, and there's around 3,000 or 4,000 patents in every phone, they were being developed in the 80s and 90s. And the people that sit behind miniaturized cameras, sit behind these things, are the guys that are taking their share of IP income from every single mobile telephone player today. So there is a huge economic opportunity in this, as well as a massive planetary impact.
But a big challenge ahead. Codie, could you give us a bit of context about how we have got here? So just in terms of the development of this market to the point where we're at, and a bit of this idea about how this has emerged from the broader offset scenario, and then maybe also a bit onto the voluntary and compliance market, which I think people will have heard about, but again, won't necessarily know exactly how those work and what the differences are between them.
Sure. So, it's quite interesting, this journey, because I started around 5.5 years ago working on carbon removal. And I think my own professional journey has been actually quite mirroring the journey of carbon removals in how it's been perceived and acknowledged and known about in the public sphere, and as well as the policy sphere. So when I started out, I did not know a thing about carbon removal. I was reached out to by a friend who said, hey, we're starting this group. We're trying to socialize this idea of carbon removal. And maybe like some people in the room, I went, what the hell is that? And I got involved in a volunteer basis, looking to socialize to policymakers. Hey, what is CDR? And similar to what you were saying about like IP and the business opportunity, when I learned a lot about this, I went, wow, isn't that the most no-brainer investment opportunity that I've ever seen? Because we have all of these net zero targets, these climate targets. And ultimately, I think the easiest way to explain what CDR is it is the net in net zero. Emissions reduction gets you to one place, and then CDR gets you the rest of the way because you still have some emissions left. When we started setting these net zero targets, if you actually look at it from a policy perspective, they're mostly just counting on, we're going to increase our forestry sector, our LULUCF, our land use sector by X amount, and that's going to balance all of our emissions that we have left. We'll sort that out in 2050, but basically the trees are going to sort it out. And what I was doing and what other people in this space were doing was trying to explain not only to policymakers, but also to corporates, is that that's not really going to work, because ultimately forests can burn down and there just isn't enough land to go around. And this is where you start getting into these ideas of, well, what are the other things we can actually do to extract carbon from the atmosphere? And also, like you both were saying, it's a systems. What kind of systems can we play with that actually extract CO2 from the atmosphere? So from a policy perspective, we were starting at zero, to be honest. We were starting at that assumption that forestry was going to be able to balance us out there. And now we're starting to see, I think the UN IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, really helped bring the sector really a lot forward, because it showed in its models, it's like, hey, we're going to need billions of tons of this. What does that mean? Well, I don't think we need to focus on the numbers too much. It just means that we need to have a massive CDR sector. And so what we've seen now is countries getting a little bit more precise, and corporates starting to get a little more precise about what does net zero really mean for us. And that's where you start to see CDR starting to emerge. In the UK has been a leader in this place. I mean, looking at how do you actually start funding these new technologies to scale it up to be commercially deployed at 2050. Under the previous administration in the US, you started seeing hundreds of millions of dollars thrown at this problem, looking to scale up the fans, as you so say, these big, giant million-ton scale hubs of fans pulling air out of the atmosphere to sequester the carbon.
I have to just tell you a fact that I worked out, which demonstrates how nerdy I am. That the amount of CO2 that if you had imagine this imaginary balloon and you wanted to pump CO2 and using other brands are available, a Dyson hairdryer. I worked out the kind of volumetric flow on a Dyson hairdryer. And if you were to inflate a balloon with all the amount of CO2 that you needed to take out the atmosphere to stabilize it, it would take you 32 billion years, which is twice the age of the universe, to do that. So you're talking a huge amount of gas. Sorry.
No, of course. Yes, we're dealing with massive amounts of gas. If no one's gotten that yet, I don't know if you're listening. But the real question then for policy is, and for investors as well and companies, is, okay, well, how do we scale up all these different ways of tackling this problem? And what you see now from mostly Europe, because we're climate forward now in this world, is we're looking to develop new ways of getting these technologies out from the lab, because they're past the lab now. They're ready to be commercially deployed. But we need, and I'm sure we'll get into this later, we need to actually make them bankable. And so I think right now, from a policy perspective, we're starting to see the shift from the voluntary carbon market, your traditional thing where you think about offsets, to more of a compliance. To operate, you need to balance your emissions. And part of that, you will need carbon removal. So we're starting to see that kind of come into play now.
And how developed are the compliance markets in terms of how's the regulation kept up with this? I mean, how much regulation has actually been passed on for this compliance area?
We're at the very novel stage of this. So the way I like to explain it is that we, at least from a policy perspective, if you say start 5 years ago, just letting them know what this is, okay, fair enough. Then we started setting the foundation. So there's a certification, trying to bring that in-house into the government, trying to set a standard that can be trusted. So in the EU, you have the carbon removal and carbon farming framework. That is to make an EU standard for what is a removal, essentially. And from there now, they're trying to build out funding for this. And the compliance market, you have a cap and trade emissions trading system here for industrial installations in the UK, and you have one in the EU as well. And now they're looking to integrate it. Later this year, we'll have a proposal about how do you actually add carbon removals into the system. It's a whole different discussion whether or not that's actually going to do anything. I have some views on that. Yeah.
Okay, so we're still at the very, very early doors. Svenali, can we get a bit to how does this stuff get built? I mean, how does this stuff get paid for at the moment? If we haven't necessarily got, a marketplace that's fully functioning, working, how do you get this stuff built? Who's saying to you, yeah, go ahead, here's some money, great, go for it. How do you make it work?
The $1 billion question. I think it's really useful to kind of bridge what Codie you've just said, which is we're in the nascency of someone actually making us build these things, right? And so no one's actually making us build these things. No one's giving us a gold star for doing these things either. And so it becomes really, really problematic to forecast in the future and say, actually, by 2032, governments will have figured this out and they would have told us exactly what to buy, when to buy it, and what price. And you're kind of working backwards from there and you're going, oh crap, if I don't set up enough projects now, if I don't actually build up capacity now, I will not have enough credits for people to buy then. And a lot of the work that we do at Curate is to try and forecast these supply-demand situations. And one of the things we're already seeing is that if we continue to produce the levels that we're producing, there's going to be a price jump of at least 60% by the time we get to the early 2030s. So that's kind of the context in which these project developers are actually building these projects. So I thought it's a useful kind of link back to who is building this, why are we building it, and my take on the possibilism of how do we actually do this. So I think I would love to start with the fact that it's really good to remember that this is not the first time that we as a civilization are trying to invent new things. We've done this for years and years and years. The most recent really good example outside of mobile phones and semiconductors, we've got renewables. AI is a really big one, right? And I think that in all of this, CDR, birthing CDR, scaling CDR, we're not really turning the wheel anymore. We're sort of also not doing rocket science, quite literally. We are taking things that have been done before that's around us, like Rich, you mentioned in the opening, and replicating it. And I think this is how we're going to continue to see business being done, really. So to me, that is a really exciting prospect. But the challenge of actually building these things is best, I think, in my brain, defined as a catch-22. So typically, these things are contracted based on order. Someone says, it's a really good idea to build a giant fan, and we will just rely on the fact that somebody else will need these carbon credits to compensate for their residual carbon footprint. The problem is that companies and these projects need money to build the thing, but the payment for the thing will only really come after the thing has been delivered. And so you're kind of stuck with this thing. You're stuck with this mismatch of pricing where you need the money, but you can't get the money. So the way that most projects actually try and get the money is by pricing it back into a carbon credit. And if you just compare prices between what is available on, often we'll talk about VCMs, voluntary carbon markets, and you'll think about, offsets, and you'll think about carbon credit prices there. The typical ranges of carbon avoidance credits and it's probably useful to actually talk about carbon avoidance here as well. Not removal, but it's the cost of a ton of carbon that is avoided from future production. So you can take examples of clean cooking, you can take examples of protecting a nature reserve. But most buyers are actually used to paying for those kinds of credits that range from anywhere between $5 a ton to $30 a ton. And those projects are then benchmarked against these projects that are needing a lot of capital and have no other ways of funding. And so automatically, when people are trying to build these projects, they are starting to index price towards $100, $150, $200 range, which makes it really, really unaffordable. So that's one way in which these projects finance themselves. Codie, you mentioned the example of projects leaning on government funding, and that's been a really, really good driver of capital into this particular area, especially the early innovation stages. But I think VC, which I think, Rich, your team does really, really well, is catalyzing that initial tech development. And so VC has basically taken on a lot of tech risk and the initial building risk. But the problem often also becomes, okay, we've sort of started to catalyze these things. How do we take that and then scale it? So the way I like to think about it is you've kind of tested the prototype in a lab. How do you then bring it to a field? And from field, how do you then bring it to 10x? And for each stage, there's a different mechanism that's really required. So at the lab stage, government funding might be excellent, and a VC funding might be excellent as well. But as you go to field, you actually need much more capital. And at that stage, I think the purchase of carbon credits becomes a really powerful tool. And what we start to think about is then these long-term purchase agreements, which again we've learned from renewables. We used to call them PPAs, power purchase agreements, that were just binding commitments from buyers to say, "Hey, if you build this thing, I will come and buy that from you." And those were delivered over long periods of time, so 10 to 15 years. And that's a really good mechanism to then show to investors for a particular project that if you build it, there will be demand that comes and buys it. So we start there, and we call it within carbon removals offtake agreements. And where do these offtake agreements come from? They typically come from very, very early buyers who believe in this market, who know that their footprint is going to be obnoxiously large. You'll have seen lots of names out in the market of hyperscalers like Microsoft and Google coming out and seeding this market. But there are also smaller players who are actually banding together. And when they band together to do this, it's called an advanced market commitment, which is actually a pretty powerful way to go out there and not only use the power of brands together, but also to say, hey, policymakers, know that we are catalyzing this market so that you can actually help us build the market for the rest of the industry. And then I'll say one more thing and then pause. When we're thinking about lab to field and field to sort of 10x, the last component that starts to become really, really important is capital from banks, which is more commercial financing. This industry is still not at that stage where we can get hundreds and hundreds of millions coming from banks. I spent a lot of my time on a daily basis talking to banks and trying to see whether they could finance this industry. And I think often the answer is, well, we can't really take the operational risk. But then templates start to become really useful as well. We have, again, done this in different industries. I love this example of a colleague. A colleague uses this example quite a bit, but the example is mattress companies. It's a pretty staple product, mattresses. If you have a mattress warehouse, you basically have orders coming in and out on a wholesale basis. A buyer comes to you with a piece of paper and says, "Hey, Sonali, I need 10 mattresses. I don't have the money to actually get the 10 mattresses from somewhere else to sell it to the person." So I go to the bank and I go, "Hey, bank, can you actually subsidize this for me?" And the bank is able to bridge the capital between when I source those mattresses and when I actually pay it. I deliver it to the person that's put the order in. And the same logic applies here as well. So we take the said offtake agreements, we can start to bring it to the banks and we can say, hey, we know there's a big buyer sat behind the offtake agreement. It's a Microsoft. Microsoft's going to come and pay if this company delivers the carbon credits. Can you actually bridge that capital? And that exists.
And that exists, and that can happen, but is that predicates there being quite a lot of demand for these products to be able to go that, to be at scale? Is that demand currently there? And how are we seeing that demand? Is that what is the state of demand worldwide at the moment?
Yeah, I mean, I'll start and then would love to throw back to Codie and Rich as well. I think the demand is nearly not where we want it to be, right? But I think that demand's growing faster than it has in the last 6 years. In 2025 alone, demand's grown tenfold. And yes, the biggest purchases are limited to few buyers at the moment, but I think that tons matter. We've also seen, we were talking about how many tons are being delivered at the moment and being removed. Last year alone, we removed 500,000 tons. And so while demand is catching up, supply is catching up as well.
Okay. Codie, what do you think? I mean, how, in terms of policy, how much are you expecting policy to move this demand?
I think that ultimately at an end state, you need to regulate people to buy carbon removals, essentially. Because carbon removals is due to its cost, ultimately one of the hardest things we have to do. If we are serious about climate change, then we have to be really, I suppose, mandated to actually do this stuff. The way I like to think about it is you produce a certain amount of waste in your home and you have a regular, you can't just throw out the window. And we need to start thinking about, I think, carbon in that way. I'm not saying we need to think about it now, especially not with the current green lash that's going on from a regulatory standpoint. But ultimately, that needs to be, I think, the end state, where if you are a fossil fuel producer, for example, let's not just put it all back on us. If you're a fossil fuel producer and you produce carbon, you have to make sure that that carbon is durably removed from the atmosphere, unless if you're not able to reduce that emission in the future. And so that's really where we think that a lot of the demand is going to come from essentially being a service out there that says you have to actually deal with your carbon, essentially, just like the same way you deal with your trash.
Yeah, I think the way we would think about it is, in the moment we are in a world of want. So companies have to want to buy carbon removal, and companies like Microsoft and others, you could say, are acting kind of semi-philanthropically, right? They're saying they don't have to do it. They're doing it to manage a bit of reputation, to be able to, position themselves and be able to talk about their commitments and so forth. But they don't have to do it. Where, of course, as soon as you're in a compliance market, you have to do it. Now, if you imagine the conversation around a board table, at the moment you've got, the chief sustainability officer who's going, hey, we got to do this because it's the right thing to do. And you might have the chief marketing officer who's going, hey, we can do some really great adverts about helping forestry and little fishies and all the other bits and pieces that are great around this. And then, you sit around the board table and the CFO's like, well, that doesn't float my boat. And the CEO's going, Trump's just got all these tariffs. We're not even going to think about it. This is next year's problem. So the challenge we have is that we're in this voluntary want market and we're moving inexorably towards a need market. As soon as the need market is there, the CFO is like, I've got to comply. This is non-negotiable. I've got to find the budget to do it. And the CEO is like, I can't take the risk of not complying. So the question is, what happens in the market between when it's a want market, the voluntary market, and a need market, which is coming at in an indeterminate time, and how pressing is that need is a function of price and risk. So I think the era we're in now is enlightened organizations are semi-philanthropic, are wanting it, but the specter of risk of not being ready is getting more and more. The specter of risk is not as scary today as it was maybe 12 months ago because of the way the global noise and the kind of Trump hysteria is out there. But it is absolutely on the agenda. So I think the challenge we have as an industry is to create enough momentum, enough understanding, enough clarity around the nature of risk and the nature of opportunity that sufficient people around that board table start to move the dial on creating the kind of level of demand from a banking perspective, see that it's an inevitably large market and they need to get into it. And we're kind of at the foothills. But, this is a long road. It's an annoying road if you've been doing it a long time, but you're on a road at least.
And there isn't a small, treacherous part of your heart that worries that the green lash is going to be so big that this idea of this compliance is basically doesn't get over the hurdle at all.
Well, can I just say on that, if we know that we need this at the end, and we know that we need a large scale, ultimately the way we think about it as a nonprofit organization is how do we limit the total cost of society? So how do we lower the cost essentially? And that's why this is so critical, these kind of years in between when it's regulated that you have to pay that bill, that we actually put as much as we can in terms of scaling the technology, proving that it works and bringing and optimizing costs down. And that's why we need investment now. Because if you can imagine your carbon removal bill is double what it could be, triple what it could be, well, the way I see it is it's probably the first thing to go. Whether you're a company that doesn't have to do it or you're a policymaker that says, well, shouldn't we be building something else?
It's fine.
No, I was going to say, It's really interesting. So I think we know that this needs to be done, but often that mandate alone doesn't build the trust that people need, and they're still worried about the reputation. And a lot of that, I think, comes down to data. So the more that you can show that these projects are doing what they're supposed to do, the more you can start to quantify it in numbers, the more you're then supposed to, are able to prove that actually the learning is compounding. The first generation of fans that were built are actually much farther in the journey. The later generation are so much farther than the first generation fans were built, and that they can actually be stacked one on top of each other, that they can be ferried around the world and set up wherever, and can be regenerative so that they don't extract more energy. If you can start to prove those things in numbers, I think that's when the change happens. I think that's when you start to correlate price, and that's when you start to generate more trust.
But I think we do have a fundamental challenge of what the societal discount rate is for this, right? In the sense that, and we're seeing it in Europe at the moment. They're going, oh my God, Russia, Ukraine, isn't that tricky? Yes, we need to increase our kind of, defense spending to 3%, 4%, 5%. We're like, oh God, that's really difficult when we've got, all the bills on NHS and all the other bits and pieces. It's really difficult until the point at which you're invaded, and then everything else goes out the window and you invest in it. And the challenge we have with everything around climate is no one sees today's problem, a 30-year problem, a 20-year problem, a 10-year problem. The discount rate is so illogically high to creating activation energy that ultimately the kind of the success and the momentum around carbon removal is going to be dictated around the human perception of that discount rate and the alternatives and the other things that are deemed more important at the time. And it's human nature. We've seen it again and again in virtually every single kind of human challenge, which has got that short-term reactive thing versus a longer-term, decisive investment horizon. So it's part of, it's as old as economics and beyond.
It's the human condition. Yeah. But on the slightly happier moments, let's talk about some innovation and some of these integrity issues and how the industry is dealing with those, because obviously leaps are being made. Let's hear some of the kind of the good news changes that have been happening at the moment.
Yeah, I don't disagree with the conundrum at all, but I also think that the people that are going to make through this little valley that we have to cross before it becomes mandatory and before everybody realizes panic, we must act now. I think are the people that are able to demonstrate value in current contexts. And a really good example of that is if we are able to show that carbon removal can in fact pair with other industrial processes, reduce the cost of doing things like capture waste or treat waste, make it cheaper to actually build things that we know we're going to need, like sustainable aviation fuel. I think there's an argument to actually start investing in both things at the same time. We work with a lot of hard-to-abate companies at my day job, and a big argument that the CFO almost always comes round to is how does this investment at the moment that is climate shaped, that is good shaped, actually stay in parallel with some of the things that I'm being asked for right now, which is my bottom line and my sort of risk prevention. And so I think a good example is wastewater treatment plants. CDR, Hidden and Rich, your portfolio company, does this. I'm such a big fan and cannot stop talking about it. Crew Carbon. They took something that has been an iterative process on an open field. In sort of CDR land, we take alkaline materials, and an idea was if we add alkaline materials to the soil or we add it to water, it will help us capture carbon because that's a natural weathering reaction. If you take that and you start to measure it in open environments, that measurement starts to become really, really hard because there are natural catalysts at play. But then you change that and you put it within a confined plant, like a wastewater treatment plant, and it becomes really, really easy to measure it. And so there are lots of innovations that are happening as an iterative way that I'm feeling very hopeful about.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, shall I just provide a bit more flavor on that? Because, I mean, this is what we do. So the thing that's really heartening about it is, if I rewind the clock 5 or 6 years when we started this, we thought we'd be investing in this little isolated kind of sandbox of carbon removal and just there. And the longer we do it, the more we realize that many of these solutions are integrated into a lot of other business systems and so forth. And wastewater is a great one. So at the moment, when you're treating wastewater, you use a lot of chemicals. Some of them are quite nasty, like caustic soda, which is an incredibly alkaline material. If you change that by adding limestone, naturally quarried limestone, and you really intelligently mix it and monitor it, you can reduce the amount of caustic you're using, have much better process control, and pull down CO2. Similarly, if you put limestone into river systems that are heavily acidified, and many river systems are now heavily acidified because of acid rain, extreme weather events that flush organic matter into rivers at opportune time. By making them more alkaline, you turn them into, everyone's heard of these chalky streams in Hampshire where all the trouts live, into more chalky, which is what limestone is, rebalance it back to the natural alkalinity levels, it draws down CO2. So you can not only improve biodiversity in rivers, you can draw down CO2. It's the same in oceans. By shifting ocean alkalinity, which are acidifying, you can help oceans draw down CO2. And then similarly, we've seen businesses where you can take CO2 from the atmosphere, you can put it into particular specially defined minerals, which when you add them to cement, when the cement is curing, it gives up the CO2 that you've just taken from the atmosphere, carbonates cement. And as Romans used cement 2,000 years ago, that carbonated cement is considerably stronger than normal Portland cement today. So there's everything from the built environment to wastewater treatment to, rivers. So thinking about how carbon removal piggybacks, allies, many of our systems, natural, industrial, or otherwise, is kind of a really good entry point into this, where as opposed to having to pay the full cost of carbon removal, you're maybe making a process or a new system or a new supply chain have a 10% return on capital rather than a 4% return on capital. And that's where the CFO begins to get interest, and we start reinventing industries. And, we've been involved in a magnesium business, which is moving from mined magnesium to taking magnesium from sea brine and doing it 1/20th of the carbon intensity, while the byproduct itself sequesters carbon. So it becomes a carbon negative metal, which is the first time you've ever produced a carbon negative metal. Now, no one would have looked at that if you weren't thinking about this thing from the carbon end of the telescope. Sorry, I could talk about this forever, but there is so much that could happen that transforms things we don't even think about in wastewater to things that we should think about, river health, to things that, quite frankly, we use every day, metals and minerals and all the other bits and pieces. I think it's a really fascinating space. It's just so complicated that part of the challenge for policymakers, part of the challenge for the general public and for corporates is they just, when you're presented with this huge diversity of opportunity and kind of a solution set, it's really difficult to know what the hell you should be doing.
Yeah, and I obviously within that system, there's also this kind of verification. So it's like, all this choice, all of it different lengths, all of it different, presumably different amounts. I mean, again, Codie, could you use a bit of a kind of maybe also more good news on some of this verification that we know that what we're getting is what we say we're getting? How's that developed over the last couple of years that we can feel a bit more confident about when we're buying some of this stuff?
Yeah, so you touch on a really important note, which is there's been no controversy yet, and that's actually where all the controversy sits.
Yeah.
Which is so the VCM 1.0, what you think of when you read those Guardian articles about the big scandals where these big projects didn't deliver any emissions reductions, and actually the first people doing the projects didn't receive any money. That is a big issue with carbon removals, because ultimately you are providing a service saying, well, I am going to mitigate your environmental damage and you're going to pay me for it. But that only makes sense if you know that environmental damage has been counterbalanced, offset, whatever, neutralized, whatever word you want to use, right? And so I've spent the last couple of years working with the European Commission on creating the carbon removal certification framework. It's got a different name now, but I like the old name better. Where we're trying to create methodologies for actually how do you measure these different carbon removals. Some are quite easy, relatively. The fans, direct air capture, because essentially all you're doing, it's an isolated system. You're running air through a contact fan, and then you're concentrating it, and you can see what comes in. You can see how much CO2 you have at the end. You talked about open systems. And that is much more difficult to pin down. Well, if I add X amount of mineral or whatever to this river and it increases the alkalinity, well, how do I measure what I actually did, right? And so the way we look at it is that we need to increase the measurability of these removal methods, because more than anything, you need that trust, so you need to know what you're doing. But there's been tremendous amount of work being done in that way. And so what we're seeing now is that we have methodologies at the EU level for biochar, which is great. We have methodologies for direct air capture and for when you capture from the combustion of biomass. Because when trees, as we already talked about, they absorb atmospheric CO2. And if you burn that and if you capture it, or if you do something else with it, ferment it, so to speak, you capture that CO2 and store it underground, then you know that you've got permanent removal. So we have those three methodologies right now, which is great, because now buyers can say, okay, we have an EU standard now. I think that's a good thing. And now we're starting to work on more of the complicated things. So ocean removal, enhanced rock weathering, when you start actually grinding up minerals that react with the atmosphere and start sucking down carbon. But like how you actually do that stuff, it's really complicated. But there are, scientists working on these projects which are really focused on not making the mistakes.
And actually, AI is actually a massive breakthrough in that space, because the amount of data, the amount of kind of non-correlated data forms that sit out there is, if you were trying to tackle some of these modeling problems 10 years ago, you just couldn't have done it. And now, with kind of state-of-the-art measurement and new measurement tools that are becoming available, and we've invested in a few of those, together with AI modeling, you begin to go like, oh, maybe we can measure some of these tricky open systems. Maybe we can model them. And that starts to change the kind of the calculus on the three factors you were saying. The probability of you knowing that a ton of carbon is a ton of carbon and not kind of going back into the atmosphere 3 years later, that starts to create confidence. And part of this is confidence.
And I think a lot of the time that we spend as well is taking a variety of these methodologies and standards that exist in the market, condensing it into a way that is a singular framework, and then using that as a basis powered by AI to actually recommend to buyers what it is that they should be indexing for, given the constraints that they have. Buyers might have constraints around delivery timelines, budgets, geographic preferences, and the way that we look at it is through 5 different models as well. So things like impact, what is the carbon impact of this particular project? Integrity, how sound is the process? We look at delivery risk as a very big component as well, which kind of talks at what is the probability of the delivery. And even within that probability, we start to look at financial risk. Is the project well funded to be able to do that? Things like beyond carbon, which is how well is this project actually integrated with the socioeconomic realities of the project around and society around. And then last being future potential, which is if this project is being seeded now, how likely is it to actually scale to a gigaton stage?
So this is what my next question for you. It sounds all lovely, but they all sound kind of like little kind of artisanal kind of activities. Wonderful. How do we scale this? I mean, all these things. I mean, is it going to be that we're going to have 1 or 2 winners coming out of all these different types that, let's say in 10 years, like Betamax and, VHS, it's like, no, that was, you were an idiot to go from that perspective. Is that necessary for this stuff to scale at this point we need to do it? Or is just because demand, if we get the compliance market so great, we need all of it?
I think we need more corporate buyers. I mean, so I spend a lot of my time working on carbon capture and storage, which some removal methods depend on. And it scared me a little just seeing how much of actually this other technology portfolio depends on Microsoft buying carbon removals. So there is a project in Norway. It's the first of its kind. Loads of carbon capture, point source carbon capture projects are linking to it, and they're sending ships to store geologically their carbon in Norway. And I saw a presentation from the project, and around 3/5 of the projects have been made bankable because of Microsoft buying their removal credits. Because in these installations, you have, say, half of your emissions are fossil, the other half are biogenic, and then that's your carbon removal credits. So it's precarious right now. I think that we need to find some ways of crowding in more corporate buyers, making it more clear to them that, this is the cool thing to do, essentially. And we do need more, I say, things like frontier advanced market commitment, essentially pressure on these companies to really start getting involved. I think we could see more from other hyperscalers as well, especially as they're trying to scale up all these AI data centers.
But I think, your question is this what's going to create the solution set? And, if we flip around and say, what's creating the answer to renewable energy, right? And it's kind of solar, it's wind. And if you look on a 40-year time horizon, you might go, okay, there's maybe fusion out there. But that's kind of it. So it's pretty easy to understand. If you're a banker, if you're a funder, if you're a policymaker, you go, right, I just need to get these big fans up here. So not the big fans, the big turbine blades, or I need to get fields and argue with farmers about whether that's the right thing to do and how it affects everything else. I think the answer to carbon removal is going to be like this glorious patchwork quilt, right? So in the global south, it's going to be more community scale, really interesting projects, which will help some of those communities. And hopefully money will flow from the first world to those markets to help those happen. We're going to see big industrial applications in the metals or the mining industry, where suddenly they'll be factoring carbon removal as part of their solution set. We'll be seeing biochar leading into biochar into cement or into building materials or into other things. We're going to see the recognition of the value of carbon in all of these activities. And on one side, you might think it's all going to be artisanal, but the reality is if it's embedded in everything we do, that's amazing. Because it just becomes a part of every business's economic model, and you're either directly doing it as part of your day-to-day trade, or you're buying in these offsets or certificates as a part of your, kind of
business model,
carbon tax behavior, if you like. So I think it's going to be really exciting, but it's not going to be, hey, it's a whole massive wind farm in Dogger Bank. It's going to be hidden in a lot of places, and it's going to be paid for in some kind of distributed, priced manner. So I think it's kind of, it's kind of semi-hidden, but some of the projects will look really obviously carbon and other projects will not look obviously carbon.
I completely agree. I think that there are so many methods that haven't even been invented yet. It's too early to say that there's a winner takes all. And I also think that it's too early to say that this will be a public good. I think the cost will be distributed across different parts of society.
Okay, I think let's look to this. This is part of the future anyway, but let's look at two timescales: 2030 and 2050. 2030, what will be true, and what will have changed in the next 5 years that's definitely happening that you can see we can see this progression happening the next 5 years. What will we be?
Well, I think of everything through climate targets. So 2030, 2050, we need to be here, we need to be there. I think by 2030, in an optimistic scenario, that we start seeing a lot more deployment, a lot more support from, I suppose, governments to actually start crowding in that capital and start co-blending the financing with it. So it's not all just venture capital or VCM funding. And 2050, I mean, what's realistic or where do we need to be are two different, I think, questions right now. We need to be removing 1 billion tons by 2030. That's what the IEA has set, the International Energy Agency has set. So we have 4 and a bit years.
500 times growth.
Yeah, let's go.
In 4 years.
Correct.
Yeah.
Possible?
In a possibilistic world, yeah. I think that 2030 in in my mind, actually 2020s in my mind, is the learning decade. We're going to learn, we're going to make a lot of mistakes, we're going to figure out what works and what doesn't. 2030s is when we actually have a chance in health to go get it and scale it. Hopefully, regulation will have kicked in by then. Hopefully, we'll have agreements and standards. And hopefully, by that point, we're not explaining to people why CDR matters. And 2050, if the possibilistic world exists, then it's sitting in the engine in the background everywhere. But I do think that the people that are investing now will have the biggest opportunity to learn. And a really good example is I spend a lot of my time with financial services. When I started in this industry, we were the only game in town trying to figure out how to make financing work from banks. And now there's at least 5 to 10 players globally deploying capital into these projects. And that's the pace of learning, which has been incredible.
We're not going to do enough, would be my opening kind of in 2030 or 2050. I think by 2030, given the kind of economic, political situation moment, I think what is going to happen is that the cheapest carbon removal, most integrated subset of carbon removal is going to make really interesting progress. So the kind of crew carbons and some of the other spaces where they're assisted by the nature of kind of this multimodal revenue stack. I think the other thing we're seeing, this is often seen as heresy, is we're going to see things like Corsair, which is the international airline body that's talking in the EU about introducing mandatory requirements to move into sustainable aviation fuels. If you look at the cost of sustainable aviation fuels, especially eSAF, that's upwards of $1,000 a ton of CO2 is the cost of doing that. Now, if you can deliver carbon removal, which you can today for under $300 a ton, if I'm sitting as the atmosphere and I'm saying I'm completely agnostic as to whether you put a ton of CO2 in from an aeroplane and take it out, or you do sustainable aviation fuels and you don't put it in the first place, as the atmosphere, you don't care. But if I know as an airline that I could use carbon removals as opposed to sustainable aviation fuels at a third of the price, I would be lobbying hard to EU, to all of the things to say we should be allowed to use carbon removals. So I'm convinced in marine, in aviation, in some other spaces, we're going to see the acceleration of carbon removal in these hard to abate spaces, which I think up until recently, we'd always thought it's a 2040 problem. So I think we're going to see a really, really interesting kind of dogfight in all of these decarbonization spaces for lowest cost, because that's the world we're in. And then I think what we're going to then see is this kind of really interesting kind of global scale out from kind of 2040 on. But it's going to be a really interesting bun fight over the next decade.
I think just to build on that, when we think of a compliance market, so, you tax for your amount that you emit, like, why do we even consider carbon removals in that? And it's exactly what you just said, is because, well, there's a price point where it just doesn't make sense to reduce that emission. I mean, because in some industries, what we say a marginal abatement cost curve, how much it costs to abate each emission, it looks a bit like a hockey stick. So it's like, we can pay it out. Maybe if we're optimistic, we can pay that. And then it's just like, well, who the hell is paying €1,000 per ton? And that same question comes to the aviation sector. And I think by 2050, we'll start getting a lot more clear about actually maybe carbon removal makes a lot more sense in more places than we thought it initially did. And I think that's when we start need to thinking about, as we've talked about tonight, about maximizing those co-benefits, where it makes sense, where if you're doing a carbon removal, you're producing some sort of co-benefit, whether that's biochar and enhancing water retention and agricultural production, or if you have, say, like waste streams of energy or heat, that you're putting those towards carbon removals. I mean, there's a really interesting project here to build a direct air capture plant with the nuclear Sizewell C, using just the waste heat to power it. And you think about all those integrations to like lower that cost. But it's a little bit controversial to say because ultimately we think about carbon removal just being at the very end. But I think we're actually going to need carbon removal a lot more in the middle of our journey than we actually realize.
I mean, this is one of the reasons why people have been sometimes critical, is this element of moral hazard that you bring in when you do this form of abatement. I mean, is this an issue that keeps you up at night?
Doesn't keep me up at night, but moral hazard is around us, not just in this space, right? And I think the challenge for us is how do we, if you take a big step back, what is the best thing for the atmosphere? If you be completely objective, what is the best thing to reduce concentration of CO2? And I'm willing to take a dollop of moral hazard, knowing that I can actually deliver much higher impact on the atmosphere. And I think that's the equation that kind of we deal with. I would hate to see the nature of moral hazard swing too far in that way, but I think carbon removal's got a really interesting place where as long as you can manage that moral hazard, you're in a net atmospheric positive position.
I think moral hazard's really hard to define. It's essentially we're saying that, we can depend on something in the future. And I think not doing anything in the near term makes that risk real. But it doesn't keep me up at night. And I frankly think we're maybe too worried about it because ultimately we're not doing enough right now anyway. So what does carbon removal have to do with stopping us from doing that? If someone's saying it's an excuse, we'll do it later on, that's a whole different issue. But right now, I mean, we need to be doing a lot more emissions reductions regardless of if carbon removals exist.
My take is that if there is moral hazard and we're all actually thinking about it in this much level of detail, then that signals panic. And that also means that we need leadership to turn this around. And if there is a world in which we're doing everything we can to decarbonize, there is also a world in which we know that we need to be making simultaneous proactive investments within CDR. So I think that I acknowledge it and also believe that it's an and world. We'll have to decarbonize and we'll have to remove.
I like the and world. That's very nice. I like that. I'm going to ask one last question and then I'm going to put it out to the audience. This is an audience, our earth setters, our investors, policymakers, founders. If we as a group will leave tonight, we want to be useful as well as just informed, what should we do?
I think we need to socialize this more because it's already such a bubble. Or at least it feels like that I'm inside of one. Keep seeing the same people. But we need to socialize what this is because at the end of the day, I think it actually gives quite a good bit of hope because there are new things that are being tried by innovative people to tackle this problem. There are companies springing up left, right, and center, trying lots of new, novel ideas. And I think that gives a bit of hope, but also people need to know what this is. It's already complicated enough, this climate issue, to explain to people. But I think if you leave here tonight with a bit more of an understanding, there are opportunities to get involved from a voluntary perspective. I started my journey in carbon removals with the Open Air Collective. They're a citizen-led voluntary campaign to increase the knowledge about carbon removals in the public sphere and to pressure policymakers. It's a really active Discord. I mean, there are ways to get involved in this. And even just an hour of your week could be spent to actually kind of feeding into this and starting to grow it. Because at the end of the day, we're just a very minuscule part of this whole ecosystem. But that means that there's way more opportunities actually to get involved and to help.
I agree with that. I think the most useful thing that people in this room could do is to walk away and stop treating that we need to get a yes sentiment to carbon removal and think that it's somebody else's job to convince and educate. I think that one of the things that I'm really proud of looking back over the last 3 years is that two organizations that I worked with, British Airways and Standard Chartered, came together in an embarrassingly small deal, but decided that it would actually make sense to do a pilot to see whether a financing structure could work, whether a small step could make a difference. It wasn't because the science had radically changed. It's because they decided to experiment and they decided to do something about it. And I think that my message to everybody would be figure out what that small step for you looks like. If it's, oh, I don't actually understand what this is, go Google it, watch a YouTube video, go maybe visit a plant and see how tech is actually happening in real life. If you want to pick up the phone to somebody that is Matt or Rich and or us who knows a little bit about carbon removal, tell us, and we'd be very happy to explain. I think that the trust is only really built when more people talk about it, when more people understand it, and that compounds. And I think that makes a huge amount of difference for this market. Right?
Yeah, I guess, look, it's a really complicated space. And if you are that way inclined, then immerse yourself in the complexity, right? But I think the vast majority of people are not particularly that way inclined because it is incredibly complicated. So I guess my advice would be do not get hung up on the complexity of this. Let the kind of annoying people like me, like Codie, deal with the policy, deal with how it's measured, deal with how you actually deliver it, all the other bits and pieces, because it is really complicated, right? But embrace the fact that if you're the atmosphere, you need some help, right? And the way to get that help is reduce what we're putting into it and start to think about how we take CO2 out. And that's what this is. That's kind of all you need to know. So don't necessarily get hung up on the technicals because we spend too much time going direct air capture is better than BECCS and biochar's got this problem versus this. But that's our problem to sort out. The problem we have more generally is to just say, we need it. There's solutions. Don't worry about the detail. We just need to create the right atmosphere, no pun intended, to drive this forward.
Thank you. Right. Questions? Andrew, can we talk about durability and some of the projects like Andrew's planting trees in the Congo has criticisms from some of the buyers about this is not too short term and that makes they're ignoring some of these possibilities that are actually available right now.
There's this tension and it's really tough because amazing sounding projects like your own are struggling to get the funding. And there's a lot of attention on, say, the more durable methods, right? The way I like to look at it is that we need to find some way of communicating to people and to buyers and to policymakers that there needs to be a portfolio because we don't have a lot of time. And so I think we need to eventually shift to a place where every single fossil emission that has come from the geosphere, from underneath the earth, is balanced by something with equal enough durability. Because a CO2 emission to the atmosphere remains there around 1,000 years. That's where that 1,000-year number comes from. But is that practical right now at scale? And is it getting in the way of interesting projects like yourselves? Yes. So I think we need to, as an ecosystem, no pun intended, there is this big fight between nature-based solutions and more durable solutions. And I think that is not helping the buyer, it's not helping suppliers, and it's not helping the ecosystem. The way I like to think about it is, how can we possibly envision the world in 1,000 years? There's no way to know that tree is there. But there's no way to know that in 200 years we won't have, say, fusion energy or something. So we need to buy that time, and we need to just make sure that the protocols by which your projects are certified are trustworthy enough so that we don't need to, say, inflate the cost to make it so that you have to certify 100, 200, 300 years, but rather just that it's, there's some way to know that there's trust that that project is additional and that it's going to remain there for long enough. So it's about how do we transition from your project into either another project or into more durable as we go on.
I think it's an and world for me. And we started out with portfolios of carbon removals with some of our very first buyers that included the royal family through to the O2, through to British Airways. I think that there's lots of different parameters through which we recommend portfolios to our buyers. the co-benefits element. You can build a direct air capture company, but that's not going to give you the co-benefits that a wonderful afforestation project could provide. There's the affordability angle as well. Very few buyers are actually able to afford the $600 price tag that sits within DAC. And so when you start to kind of think about along just these two lenses, you figured out actually a portfolio is much better. And that's how we've done things even in financial markets when things weren't so, existential, if you might. I think that climate, for a very, very understandable reason, has been a circular firing squad because our financial buckets have just been so limited. So I understand where that comes from, but I do not agree that there's only one method that wins it all.
I'm with you 110%. It's a complicated space. Should we create something called a carbon decade and make that our unit? And therefore, do we ascribe price with a discount rate to 1,000 years worth of carbon storage versus 10 years? It's the same with, if you look at methane. In a 10-year cycle, methane is 90 times more potent than CO2. On 100-year time frames, it's 28 times. So there is implicitly there issues around durability, around impact. And depending on how we as a society value short-term action at a price point that a market can take and its impact ahead of, these are all the issues around innovation curve, discount rates, and otherwise. So it's massively frustrating. I think the circular firing squad is dead right. When there's not enough finance to go around, everyone's taking pot shots at the person who sits on the opposite side of the circle, which is just not a good place to be.
Can we go more into the different geographies and the requirements of some areas about who would need some of these carbon removals more than others? Who's going to lead the way? The example was Singapore. And then could you talk more about how we sell some of these things to corporates and countries, particularly thinking about physical risk and how to kind of managing that volatility?
Yeah. I can go first because that's one of the privileged lenses that I get to apply. Singapore has been home for a very long time. I also grew up in India, which is something incredible that I get to do. I think in the long arc of development of the world in general, you see push and pull of dynamism. For a very long time, we've said, the global north needs to help the global south get to a certain place. For the first time in my lifetime, I'm seeing that the global south's basically said, we don't need it. We'll just build things because we have the energy and we can create opportunity right here. And that's coming out of two threads, really. One, fundamental climate change impacts being felt quite acutely, really. And that's impacting supply chains. It's impacting people's livelihoods. It's impacting health. One of the other things that's happening is people are starting to realize the immense sort of economic opportunity of all of these things. You get jobs. I think, Rich, you said that at the beginning of the session. You get cost reductions. There's lots of different angles, and physical risk is a really interesting one as well. And I'm seeing all of that play very acutely within that region. What is interesting is that Singapore, Japan, India, to me, are coming out in that region with lots of different demand parameters. So Singapore is trying to look at it from a buyer's club angle as well. They are, some of the biggest, I suppose, aviation and shipping hubs in the world, and how the government's kind of stepping in to see how they can facilitate the corporates to adopt technologies as well. Japan's obviously brought carbon, the ETS, which is the compliance market, live, but also thinking about integrating carbon removals this year. Japanese corporates are investing in joint ventures with carbon projects across the world, and especially in select geographies, so they can actually learn about these projects firsthand. So there's an insetting narrative as well. So there's lots of interesting dynamic work that's happening that I think we here in the global north can actually learn from. Is my message.
Yeah, I think I'll just say two things. We're currently raising what we're calling a carbon delivery fund, so which is specifically about funding these kind of early stage projects. And the tension we have in that is what our geographic scope is. So we have investors, potential LPs in the fund who say, oh, if it's a European only thing, that's super interesting to us. And the challenge we have is if we look back to the patchwork quilt analysis, if we look at where the opportunity is for this, the opportunity for carbon removal is driven by geology, it's driven by meteorology, it's driven by soil, it's driven by a whole load of things, which means the best projects are going to be in really, really interesting geographies. You know, we've just invested in a business in Namibia, for example. So there's other things. So the challenge is going to be is where capital sees risk and where capital is willing to play in terms of investing in these kind of projects, which will be determined in no small part by the geography they're in. So I think that's a really interesting kind of patchwork quilt question. I think the second piece is a bit around how we think about physical risk, as you're saying. And I think one of the things that we hadn't articulated at all, but I think has been really useful to us in framing this, is out of Cambridge, there's a thing called the Climate Crisis Advisory Group. Mm-hmm. And they came up with this concept, the 4Rs framework, which talks about, if you imagine the climate change juggernaut keeping rolling on, and what that means. And what that means in terms of climate finance is that the impact of the climate juggernaut is that more and more funding is going to go into the 4Rs. And the 4Rs are reduction, so all the things we're talking about in emissions reduction. It's going to be removal, which is, the focus of what we're doing in the conversation today. But the other two areas is resilience, or often known as adaptation. So that's how do we make cities, make our agriculture, make our industrial systems more resilient to the impacts of extreme climate change. And then repair. So how do we repair the damage to our ecosystems, our cities of extreme climate events? Now, those two, repair and resilience, have zero return on investment. All you're doing is you're investing to maintain your current productive capacity. So from a global GDP perspective, that is a really bad thing to be doing. Now, unfortunately, the people who are going to pay for that will be everybody through taxation, because government's going to be paying for that. So then the other two plays, which are reduction and removals, are the kind of interesting IP investment spaces where certainly we think there's opportunity. But back to the physical risk issue, unless we deal with the repair and the resilience piece, and more money is going to go into that, that's just going to be a fact of life, that we're going to feel less wealthy because we're going to be repairing the impacts and having to make ourselves more resilient against it. So the reality is going to be how much of the funds available are going to be diverted into each one of those 4Rs. And that's going to change by geography, by politics, by all those other issues.
We were talking about where does the compliance markets need to, at the moment with CDR being so expensive, where this is going to actually fit into the point where it's price effective for the compliance markets, and how are we going to get to that point?
Yeah, I think we all know that the compliance markets here are thinking about integrating at some point CDR into the framework and trying to figure out how it then becomes part of the emissions trading scheme. If I flip the equation to a different example, I think one of the ways in which I've seen governments act is actually through emissions targets set out for the hard-to-abate industries. And a really good example of that is India, where some of the hardest-to-abate industries, such as steel, cement, paper, and pulp, basically now have emissions targets that they have to meet. And so the innovation really is backward in that the corporates are coming out and going, actually, there's no way that I can hit these emissions targets without making my processes more efficient. And one of the ways in which they are making these processes efficient is by integrating CDR. So Tata Steel is one of the largest steel makers in India. They're using biochar as a fuel to start to bring down their carbon intensity overall. So I think that there is a world in which that kind of solution also starts to make CDR viable. And I think that to the theme of this evening, there's going to be a patchwork of different solutions that we eventually get to that makes this viable.
Yeah, just a couple of thoughts. So I think you're right. There is a challenge. There's a price differential between the kind of EU ETS and otherwise. But I think if we just take a look at some other sleights of hand that have been used either in UK or European government, you've got the double RTFO credit for renewable transport fuel obligations for innovative fuels, right? So what that's doing is that's driving biodiesel and other fuels into transport, right? And that's because they're getting paid double the amount. So you could see a world that you say for X period, we'll have a double or a triple credit against EU ETS, specifically against CDR. Or you could see, for example, again, by sleight of hand under RED 2, RED 3 in the EU for treatment of biomethane carbon intensity as a biofuel, it adds a triple weighting into using manure as an input into making biomethane, which kind of scientifically is nonsensical that they're doing that to support Italian and French farmers. So I think there are a number of ways that you can augment a market EU ETS price in an interim basis by either double charging or putting additional, kind of weighting factors in, which then allows the development of the early market ahead of, a kind of an asymptotic drive towards, a kind of a clearing price.
So, people, when I said it was quite complicated, this is the kind of thing that I was talking about. Okay,
sorry.
Because when reading about this, this is how it gets in every level of this complicated. But I think I have to say that you've done an incredibly good job this evening of making this very, very accessible, very compelling, and really, really informational. So, thank you very much for your help. And I'd love to yours give a round of applause for our speakers tonight, please. So we've just finished the event. It was really, really good. It was a great conversation, very accessible for a very complicated subject. These guys are experts. They really made it easy to understand. There's a lot of work to do. There's a lot of hope too. Please like, subscribe, give us 5 stars if you can, and we'll see you next time. Thank you. Bye-bye.